on. What's good, everyone? Coach D here, The Shift Method. It's another first on the Shift Method podcast. Last time we had Brendan on, he was the first member to be on twice on the Shift Method. Now I got the first 3-person podcast. And who better to do it with than my favorite dietitians that I know, the wonderful Hannah and Emily. Can y'all introduce yourselves?
Yeah, of course. Emily, should I go first?
You go first because I don't know what to say.
Okay, I don't really either. I am Hannah. I am one of the 2 Up-Beet Dietitians, co-host of the Up-Beet Dietitians podcast, which has featured Damien twice.
Yes.
Once on his own, once with Brendan, who he just mentioned was also on his podcast. It's a small little circle we got going here. But along with being a podcast co-host, I also work in a outpatient weight management clinic, and I also am the owner of Help with Hannah, which is a virtual, what do I do? A virtual private practice where I coach on nutrition and also exercise. So that's me.
Yeah. And I am Emily. I'm the other half. I'm the other Up-Beet dietitian.
The other time.
Yeah. And besides doing podcast stuff, I work in for a functional medicine company. I don't think we're outpatient. No, we don't.
You guys are like not really clinical at all, I wouldn't say.
I don't know what's going on. We're a functional medicine company, but I work as a registered dietitian there too. And I do not have a cool private practice like Hannah, but that is in the works.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yes, you do. It's just not as.
Well, I guess I do technically.
According to the state of Illinois, you do.
Yes, according to the state of Illinois, EMK nutrition exists.
Yeah,
and is seen legally.
So
technically, yes. But yeah.
Very, very nice, you two. And yeah, don't let their humble attitude, kind of like shy away their accomplishments. Here they are. These 2 are studs in the industry. They have phenomenal content on YouTube. Like they mentioned, they have their own podcast. They're on TikTok. They're on Instagram. They do a lot of not only informative content, but what I really like is they do it in a very entertaining manner. Something that we all share a love for, debunking myths, etc. So if you like anything that's health, fitness, or diet related, in terms of just gaining some general knowledge, would highly, highly recommend checking them on TikTok, Instagram, etc. And I'll make sure to plug all those at the very end. But we're going to cover 3 main topics today. These are conversations that I always like to mention that I am not an expert when it comes to nutrition. I did have coursework that gives me some general knowledge, and it is an area that I do really enjoy. There's something about the physiology and how it ties into the human body and how it performs that I really do like nutrition. But I'm no means an expert. That's why I have these 3. But there's these 3 topics that I always find myself just like going in a rabbit hole like twice a year. And I'm like, it's time to revisit this because this thing just keeps popping up on TikTok. I feel like TikTok's becoming the new Facebook for Gen Z. So the myths need to go down, and who better talk about it than these 2? So the first thing I want to get into is GMOs. And this was a term, I feel like in 2000s and 2010, it like really blew up when its popularity in terms of like the culture that we live in when it comes to eating. But it's still, you hear about it here and there. So can y'all kind of just go into exactly what a GMO is exactly?
Yes, definitely. So we actually had one of our good friends who went to Purdue with us, a food scientist, little like mini plug to our podcast. She was on our podcast. So if you guys want to hear from her, kind of her perspective on this, she goes like even more in detail than we really can because she's like, again, a food scientist. But episode 14 of our podcast really goes a lot more into GMOs and chemicals and food and all of that. But we'll definitely give you the dietitian point of view on that for sure. So a GMO, what that stands for is it is a genetically modified organism. And I think the reason it's kind of like scary to people is that just like sounds like a really not a thing you want to eat. Like who actually wants to think about them eating a genetically modified organism? It doesn't really sound very tasty, but they are produced for a reason. So they are produced so that crops can like prevent their losses. They don't have to like worry about pests and use as many pesticides. I think we'll get to this in a further question when Damien talks about something else. We'll get there. But there's a lot of reasons why GMOs exist, and most of it is to benefit like the economy or the type of food or like what the food produces or whatever. So that's what they are. They are genetically modified organisms, and they are actually a good thing.
Yeah. Quickly pause. How is my feedback right now? My headphones just died.
No, you sound good to me.
Okay, I want to quickly move my microphone a little bit away from my speaker, and then I will talk.
No worries. Hey, y'all sound crystal clear.
Perfect. So, completely agree with everything Hannah just said. I think the only thing I'd really add on top of that is from a malnutrition standpoint, and also, and especially in like a lot of third world countries, GMOs are very much involved to help kind of create products that hit all those different major nutrients that someone who might be malnourished would potentially have a harder time digesting because their GI tract is just so out of whack. I know that, I think Feed My Starving Children, they developed this like rice concoction that had like all these different vitamins and minerals in it, and it actually tasted really good, but they had to create it in a way that actually, like if you were to feed an orange to someone who was not used to like fresh produce, they would not digest it well. So that's why they're also involved with that from not only just a production standpoint and agriculture standpoint and economic standpoint, also for malnutrition. So there are a lot of purposes around GMOs, why we are utilizing these, stuff like that. And we see typically GMOs the most in the US specifically, in like corn, soybeans, cotton, potatoes, papaya, summer squash, canola, alfalfa, apples, and sugar beets. I think corn and soybean get the most hate for GMOs. I think that's also because those are two products that are highly produced in the US. And to kind of keep up with the high demand, as population has grown over the past 50 years, that's why they've had to kind of change the structure of crops to keep up with that population increase. So
yeah, I want to add to that too. Like whenever you say something, I think of something else to say, but those are like the crops in the USA. So if you see a label that says like non-GMO water, that's not a thing. Like there's no GMO water. And so that also is something people use like a scare tactic with certain things, or like as a marketing tool. They can like hike up the price of water if it says non-GMO on it, but that's not a thing. Like only those crops that Emily listed can be genetically modified. So that label, that term GMO only applies to a very specific handful of things.
Yeah.
How exactly? Oh, sorry, Emily, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to ask, how exactly is something classified as GMO? Is there like certain criteria? Is it a state by state, company by company thing, or like how is that even distinguished?
I believe it's the FDA and the USDA, or a combination of the two. I forget who exactly like really spearheads that. But I think the two of them kind of work together to like make the laws and the rules around all that.
Yeah. And there is regulation around it.
Yes. You can't just like,
Right.
You can't just like be genetically modified without going through like testing and stuff first.
Yeah. No, I like that point y'all made. And I think, Emily, this kind of ties back into our podcast a little bit when we were talking about certain things with food where people always think that natural is best, right? So like Hannah and I joked on ours as well, where it's like, well, technically there is arsenic in apple seeds, or, technically there's certain products and certain things that like, obviously not from one apple seed, but there are harmful products in natural food. I mean, nature in some ways is trying to kill us and keep us alive all at the same time, all the time, right? So the thought that like, if it's natural, it's better. I never really understood that, but I think, Hannah, you pointed out correctly, it's in the name, right? From like an exercise science standpoint, we have something called degenerative disc disease. It sounds horrible. It really just means the space between your discs is getting smaller, and really it doesn't really matter too much in most cases, but you hear that and you're like, I'm dying. Like, like what's going on? So I understand how the name can kind of throw people off a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. While you were saying that, I was listening very closely, but I also was looking at my notes, and it's the FDA that are the ones who review the genetically modified crops and the feed for food safety prior to like all the marketing stuff.
Gotcha.
So, final answer, FDA.
There we go. Now, kind of like you alluded to, Anna, is that people seem to think that GMOs are more dangerous because they believe, and if I remember correctly, this is a long time ago. I don't remember what documentary it was. It might have been like What the Health or something, but where they were pointing out how, in like 1 or 2 studies involving mice, there seemed to be some weird mutations from consuming X food. It seems like GMOs, the fear mongering around it is that by consuming such foods, you may cause unnatural adverse health outcomes in your body. Is there any justification to that? And if so, how can we kind of or if there isn't, how can we maybe lay that to rest?
Yeah, that's definitely like, I think where the fear comes from is like, it's not natural. It didn't come from the soil, whatever. But again, the FDA is like playing a really big role in this. They're not just like mutating these genes and like making weird corn and then selling it at Meijer. Like it has to like go through testing and make sure that things are safe. They're not just like dishing out like unsafe products. There are a lot of like really strict protocols, is my understanding, to make sure that there aren't any threats to like human health or animal health, because actually we'll get to this, but a lot of these genetically modified crops are actually used for like animal feed. A lot of them aren't even used for human consumption. Yeah. And so for both animal and human health, these things are like really rigorously tested to make sure they are safe for consumption.
That would make sense too, because even if, like, let's say you're a cynic and you're like, oh, well, it's the capitalist system and they're trying to get our money. Well, they want their product, the animals, to be healthy. So they're giving them a product to keep them alive so they can produce meat. So in that sense, it just doesn't seem to make sense either way. Right.
Even if it's animal feed, like you think they would get lesser quality food being an animal, but you're right. Like if we're feeding our cows, pigs, and chickens not great food, they're going to produce not great quality meat, which is going to be not good for human consumption. So it's a real trickle effect there.
Yeah. And I like how Emily pointed out too, that, you know, we have a growing population. We have certain people who maybe it's harder for them to consume certain foods because of certain situations or medical conditions. So in any case, GMOs in some contexts might be better for our, you know, more modern world per se.
Yeah. We're trying to accommodate everything going on. That's kind of largely, I would say, one of the biggest motivators behind them. Granted, I don't know who invented GMO and started the GMO movement, but I'm sure that was a large contributor into kind of what their motivation was directed towards.
Is there a chance, because I think Emily may have answered this, but I just want to make sure I got this down. So would you say GMOs on average are more nutrient dense? Like they're trying, because they can make the food larger, better yielding crops. Do they generally have more, you know, dietary benefits than your run-of-the-mill non-GMO food?
Yeah. Easy answer is yes. That's kind of one of the big reasons why they even genetically modify these crops. I forget what vegetable it is. Maybe you know, Emily. That is like the common example people talk about when like debunking GMO myths. I wonder if it's like a carrot or something. Maybe it's not, because carrots aren't genetically modified, are they? I guess maybe not popularly. Anyway, there's a certain veggie that like was a really terrible vegetable before. Like it had no nutrient profile to it. It like looked weird and gross. But because of GMOs, it's like turned into a very popular vegetable, and it's like very much more nutritious, and it's easier to grow, and it's more economical. I forget what vegetable it is. I should look that up. But yes, to answer your question, that's definitely a very big benefit of being genetically modified, is having more nutrients.
Yeah. I don't know what vegetable you're thinking of. For some reason, I'm thinking green pepper, but I don't think that's right.
I think it was carrot and broccoli. Because Hannah, you just sparked like a core memory. I remember watching.
Yes.
It was in like one of my ex-phys classes or fitness assessment classes, where it was about, they were debunking the paleo diet, which talks about natural food, right? But the lady was going like, here's what a carrot used to look like, and here's broccoli kind of looked like this, it almost looked like a weed. Like it really, the crown was very, very small.
Yes.
Like,
okay. Yes.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I think I'm like that's what I'm picturing something, but I can't think of what vegetable it is, because it looks weird because it wasn't genetically modified. So yeah,
I'm gonna try and find that video because I think it was a TED talk, and I'll try and link that because that was really awesome what they were going into about how the foods used to look and like how we had to eat so much more, or you could barely eat them at all because they didn't really have much nutrients, or they were very hard to eat. Period.
Yeah. So along with like enhancing the nutrient profiles, they can also have them like ripen at a slower rate so they can stay on the shelf a lot longer. They can make it so they can like not bruise as easily, so they can like travel further distances and be more accessible. I already mentioned they can be like doing it so it's a lot cheaper to produce it, but there's a lot of reasons for these GMOs. So we really should be thanking them rather than fearing them.
Yeah.
There you go. I love them, so I'm gonna keep eating them. Nothing's changed for me.
Yeah.
Now, this next one, I would say this is more popular, I feel like, in the performance community when it comes to competitive sports that I've noticed. Again, this one kind of along the same route as the GMO track. But this one I still hear pop up every now and again, and that is the controversy, or I guess the conversation around soy. So you might have mentioned a little bit earlier about like that it is also one of those products that is highly, considered a GMO. So can y'all just briefly go over like what exactly soy is in terms of our diet?
Yes, we can. Okay.
Now I'm like blank. I'm like,
what is soy?
What is soy?
What is a soy?
What's a soy? It's a bean. There we go.
It's this, soybean. Yeah. So soy is like very, very popular, a lot more in like the vegan and vegetarian communities. Yeah. And it finds its way into a lot of like very common foods. But in terms of like eating like soybeans and like tofu, for example, is soy. That's, I'd say, a lot more commonly enjoyed if you're like vegetarian or vegan. Because if you aren't, you probably are getting most of your protein from like meat, because soy is actually a really great source of protein. I believe it's actually a complete protein, Emily. Is that right? It has all the amino acids or essential amino acids.
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah. But soy is very controversial, like Damien said, because, well, for both male and female, I'm sure we'll get more into the, I think, male perspective. But for females, it is often feared because it's believed that it can lead to breast cancer. And then in men, it's often feared because they think that it can affect testosterone levels. And the reason that these fears are in existence is that soy actually mimics this estrogen compound known as isoflavones. And they kind of like act in a similar way to estrogen, but it's like in a very mild way. So kind of debunking that right now, like soy probably won't lead to breast cancer. Soy probably won't really affect your testosterone levels because it's not really acting in the same way as estrogen as people, kind of blow it up to be.
Yeah. It's like, I don't think they found like significant changes in studies that it would mimic that. It's like Hannah said, it's such a small amount, but then people see it mimics estrogen and then runs with that.
Yes.
And we're too far gone.
No, that's such a good point, because like when you see certain things like in a vacuum, estrogen, male performance in sport, bad, right? But then like you're looking at it in a vacuum where you're not considering all the various interactions that has, or because it's not estrogen exactly, doesn't even have any effect at all in that regard. It could even have the opposite of that. Who knows? Because people are using a concept of estrogen and then just applying that blanket statement over the course of like, well, I can say I know what this does because it's somewhat similar.
Yeah, exactly. And I was actually reading to like prepare for this podcast, and I was finding more evidence that supports that eating more soy can actually like be beneficial for a lot of like men's health and women's health benefits. So like, for example, if you're eating more soy, it's often going to be in place of more animal proteins. And as we know, eating too many animal proteins cannot be the best thing for our heart health. And like high cholesterol and high blood pressure are a really big component of like for men specifically, that's often why they are prescribed medications, is because of high cholesterol and high blood pressure. And by simply replacing a lot of those animal proteins with plant protein, which is soy, that's a big one, you can simply decrease the levels or incidence of those things right there. So similarly with the breast cancer too, there's also some studies that were showing that eating more soy is actually kind of benefiting people who have breast cancer or lowering the risk of breast cancer.
That makes sense because I feel like.
Go ahead, Emily.
Damien, you go. You got this.
I don't. No, I've heard the breast cancer one, but is that also like related to too much estrogen in the system, or is that some other supposed mechanism? Like, where does that concept even come from?
Like in terms of like what causes the breast cancer and like how it's related? I believe so. I think the cause of breast cancer is very multifactorial, if that's the right word. But I mean, that would make sense that could be one of the big causes of it is increased estrogen. And so, of course, with the mimicking soy, whatever, people think that that's correlation is causation, that whole thing.
Yeah, probably a lot of like hormonal imbalances, and estrogen is most likely the one people are. I feel like estrogen and testosterone are the two hormones that people are most familiar with. So once again, that fixation on I see estrogen, I see mimics leads to this. There was something you said, Hannah, though, that you talked about how it decreased or helped like heart health, stuff like that. That kind of correlates with, I'm not out here. I know this is something that is very popular right now on social media, and I'm not out here telling people to eat a plant-based diet, but eating more plant-based in general has shown to improve like heart health and almost every aspect of health. And that very much correlates with, I would say, the research you'd found. So it was a nice connecting the dots to me.
Thank you.
While you were saying it, I was like, soybean plant.
I like to say plant forward. Like I could never go vegetarian or vegan, but obviously you should be eating a very plant forward diet. It's going to be a really good thing for anybody. You can't really argue that.
Yeah. It's always good to get different sources of protein in.
Yeah.
And all those amino acids.
Exactly.
Well, that too, if you're someone who maybe isn't super into meat, or like if you ever had soy, like it's very easy on the stomach. It's very digestible, like tofu or like, any kind of like what they call like a boca burger or whatever. Like it's super easy to get in. And the protein profile is pretty damn good for like the quantity of the food. So if you can get in more protein, like I'm all for that, man.
Absolutely. And like tofu, for example, takes the flavor of whatever. So it's a super easy protein source too.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool, y'all. So I want to move on to the third and final thing. And this one I don't really hear too much about. I think it's more so shifted to just sugar as a blanket statement. But I think as we'll talk about how those things can kind of be connected with how we talk about this topic, and that is high fructose corn syrup. So can y'all kind of just break down like what exactly it is?
So high fructose corn syrup is kind of like it's in its name. We see fructose in corn. It is a corn derivative sweetener that is made up of fructose, pure fructose, when it's in fact, or people think it's like just fructose, but it's actually just glucose and fructose, right?
Mm-hmm.
The like molecular compound of that. And it really depends on the type, because the portion can range from like 42 to 53% glucose or like 42 to 55 fructose. Very much depends on the product you're getting. But I think in most cases with table sugar, it's half and half glucose and fructose.
Yeah, so it's actually very similar composition-wise to table sugar. It's just a little bit maybe more glucose, less fructose, or vice versa, whereas table sugar is like half and half exactly.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but all, if not most, simple sugars are processed by the body in a identical way, correct?
Okay, yes, correct. Now, this is where I honestly get a little bit frazzled too, because I was reading on this as well, kind of preparing for the podcast, and I was trying to understand that sometimes fructose can be, it like involves the liver somehow. And this stuff like really just stresses me out. But like I could not quite figure out the big difference. But doesn't fructose just also break down into glucose?
Yeah.
Exactly. So I was like, I don't know what the difference is. So yes,
Maybe if there's like a compromise, the GI tract is compromised in some way.
Yeah.
Or if there's like an overabundance, like a very overabundance, then maybe it leaks out into the liver a little bit and it has to help out.
That's why I was getting confused, because what I was reading was saying that like fructose, the reason like high fructose corn syrup is often feared, or one of the reasons why it's feared, is because fructose is metabolized differently than sucrose or glucose is. And so
my understanding, that's where like the fear comes from, is like, at least what I've heard anecdotally is, well, high fructose corn syrup, like your body requires zero energy to break down. It just goes right to your bloodstream. Your pancreas goes into 8th gear and bam, just like that, type 2 diabetes. That's like the myth that I usually hear.
Yeah, and that's obviously like not the case. You know, we eat sugar, we use it for energy, and whatever we don't use does get stored, but it's not like it just like spikes your blood sugar, insulin rushes to the scene, and then boom, you've got insulin resistance and you've got diabetes. Like, it has to be like a chronic thing. And I've also been looking in this a lot too, because of the whole keto thing, and everyone's trying to fight me on keto on TikTok, and so I have to like have my sources. Anyway, I've been reading a lot more about how like type 2 diabetes often isn't even like, we can't blame it on sugar intake. Like, there's so many factors that go into type 2 diabetes. We can't just say it's because a person eats too much sugar.
Let me ask you too a question. Do you too, like, I know Hannah, you work in a weight loss clinic. Emily, you've seen and talked to people before about this topic. Do you know anyone who you would say isn't clinically obese? Like, I'm talking BMI, body fat percentage, you know, not just weight on the scale. Have you seen anyone that's type 2 diabetic who is not obese?
100%.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Okay. See, that's always something I wondered, is because I always wonder, like, well, people always blame sugar, and I'm like, maybe is it more of a, on the obesity side of things, like high body fat percentage contributing?
I think it is a multitude of things. It's partially dietary, partially physical activity levels. Additionally, there's a ginormous genetic component.
Genetics,
right.
It's huge.
I have seen many people that are eating well or healthy, whatever.
Emily hates the word healthy.
Yeah. They practice regular movement, and their lipid levels and their A1C, just because they have a family history of it, they cannot get it down, no matter what they do.
I think that genetics definitely is the biggest component. I will say I work strictly with patients who struggle with obesity. So I have seen that correlation for sure, that my patients who are losing weight, oftentimes their A1C does go down. And a lot of patients, not everyone, because again, I don't know the science behind this, is only speaking like anecdotally, but I would say, I think genetics that I've seen plays the biggest role for sure. But we definitely can't argue, or we definitely can say that if you're struggling with your weight, that also can play a really big role. I've seen that also a lot.
Yeah.
So if you're type 2 diabetic and you're otherwise healthy, active, you know, body composition is in a good place, what do you do? Like, is it medication for the most part, and like that, you know, you do your best to regulate it, or is there another course of treatment?
I think it depends on, like, you're talking like diagnosed A1C is
like
you need insulin.
I don't think we can recommend medication, but normally, yes, they are on medication because it becomes to a point where their kidneys are in danger, like they're from a nervous system that is in danger. Like, since those other lifestyle changes, other interventions are not working, medication needs to play a part, or else it could be life-threatening.
That is very interesting. I need to read up more about that then, because I've heard people mention it. I just, you know, I've never really read too much or seen too much about type 2 diabetes in non-obese populations. So that is very interesting. I'm going to have to look more into that.
Yeah, I definitely, like I said, from my clinical experience, I see the obesity side. So I can see where you're coming from, Damien. But I also do see the occasional one that Emily was kind of mentioning where it's not like that. So yeah, it's both. I think that's the final easy answer.
Yeah.
I love it.
It's so complex. Nothing is ever just like eat less sugar and you'll avoid diabetes or you'll avoid being obese. Like
Right.
everything's so complex, which is good and bad, I guess.
Yeah.
Keeps things interesting.
Yeah, it does.
I mean, this is just supposed to be a GMO soy and high fructose corn syrup, but I got a type 2 diabetes lesson, so I'll chalk that up as a W.
Yeah.
Hey, seriously, thank you two for keeping this nice and short and concise, but also packed with some really, really good information for our listeners. Can you let them know where they can find you exactly?
Of course. Yeah. So you can find us at the Up-Beet Dietitians podcast on Instagram. I believe on TikTok, Emily, is it just the Up-Beet Dietitians?
Yeah.
Okay. That's where you can kind of find, it's like our hub is probably Instagram and TikTok, but in terms of the podcast, you can find that anywhere like Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast. We have a YouTube channel if you like to watch the Zoom, us talking to each other. But again, you can like really find the links to all of those on our Instagram or our TikTok.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll be sure to link all that down in the description below. As mentioned, if you would like to see Hannah in the trenches with people talking about keto, or Emily, people just jumping on her for no reason.
Oh my gosh.
I'll be sure to link all those.
A dumpster fire. A dumpster fire.
I don't know how you do it.
You're looking for some couples.
Yeah, if you need a source of like hours of entertainment, find me on TikTok, Dietitian Hannah. My gosh.
It is.
But it has not gotten very controversial yet. I'm sure it will eventually.
Oh, eventually it does.
Yeah.
But yeah, y'all know where to find me at _shift_method on TikTok and Instagram as well. I have a couple spots for online clients left. And of course, I still do in-person training down in South Florida. If you're in the Boca Raton region, you can head to theshiftmethod.org, click any of those take action buttons. We got apparel as well, just like Hannah's got some Shift Method shirts. We got hats, you name it, we got it. Or you can just direct message me on Instagram at _shift_method. The Up-Beet Dietitians, thank y'all so much for taking time. Hope you have a wonderful day. I'll see y'all later.
Bye.
Bye.